Okay, hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the second of the MAI-DAY Textile Elements, a series of conversation piecing with Linda Brothwell and Matthew Harris. And of course, today's session is chaired by Amy Twigger Holroyd and me, Carol Tulloch. If some of you attended our first session, bear with us as we present information for those who are attending for the first time today. The event is also part of the UAL research season, which has a plethora of wonderful events all going on this month of March. Before we proceed, I'd like to run through some housekeeping. So if you feel comfortable, include your pronouns in brackets after your name. Please keep your video switched off. Please keep your audio on mute. Post any questions in the chat. There's live transcription option available. And the event is being recorded in accordance with UAL virtual event privacy notice. And there's a link for that. And will be made available on YouTube at a later date. So as I say, I'm Carol Tulloch. I'm Professor of Dress, Diaspora and Transnationalism at the University of the Arts, London, and I'm based at Chelsea College of Arts. I'm also an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum. My research focuses on difference, being, belonging, making the self, style narratives and style activism. And much of this I explored in the monograph, The Birth of Cool, Style Narratives of the African Diaspora. My stitch textiles making related research includes the contemporary chapter, There's No Place Like Home, Home Dressmaking and Creativity in the Jamaican Community of 1940s to 1960s, and the exhibition Handmade Tales, Women and Domestic Crafts. I'm also interested in the possibilities of conversation that includes curatorial conversation explored in the exhibition Jessica Ogden Still. Amy.
Hi everyone. So I'm Associate Professor of Fashion and Sustainability in the School of Art and Design at Nottingham Trent University. And my research sits at the intersection of fashion, making, design and sustainability. I have a background in knitwear design and making. And at the moment I'm focusing on my Arts and Humanities Research Council funded fellowship project, Fashion Fictions, which brings people together to generate experience and reflect on engaging fictional visions of alternative fashion cultures and systems. I guess things which connect with what we're talking about today. With Emma Shercliffe, I lead Stitching Together, which is a network that fosters critical dialogue around participatory textile making in research and practice. And I'm really interested in today's theme of piecing, which connects with my Reknit Revolution project. The project explores ways of reworking existing knitted garments using knit-based skills, techniques and knowledge. And another project is the Crafting the Commons network, which I have led over the past few years and which Linda is a member of. So we've been doing various fun things together on that, which is been linked with the Craftspace National Touring Exhibition, We Are Commoners, which is currently in Barnsley and will go to the hub in Sleaford next. So that's another thing to look up. Okay, back to you, Carol.
Thanks, Amy, thank you. So I'll just go through the origins of the idea for this series of conversation and the development and why. So MAI-DAY Textile Elements and a series of conversation is the first ever event under the Chelsea Camberwell Wimbledon Design School initiative, Making Design Agency, and part of the Design Schools conference series. MAI-DAY began as an idea I proposed as a space where members of staff on the different courses of the CCW Design School could develop thinking and practice on past, present, or future relationships of making, design, and the self. Individualized making is at the core of MAI-DAY. To quote Ved, Amit and Noel Dyke, in claiming individuality, the cultural politics of distinction, the expression of individuality as a form of social action inextricably linked to questions of belonging. I'm also interested in how this can contribute to social cultural engagement, whether local, national, or transnational. I decided on a smaller initial step to focus on stitching. It is a practice I've relied on since my teens, but in the last few years has become increasingly significant. So for example, in 2019, an invitation from Sequoia Barnes to hand stitch a quilt while two Black women talk as a performance piece at the Fruit Market Gallery, Edinburgh. Morning stitching, I do morning stitching as a form of centering of the body and intuitive stitching, work I showed to Matthew Harris at our first mentoring session in June 2020. I founded the Making Time group in November 2020 with 7 members of CCW staff. We meet on Tuesday evenings to make whatever we feel the need to, and I often just stitch. And yesterday I was cutting out patterns, so that maybe fits in very nicely with today of piecing. Attending 2 Claire Wellesley-Smith online courses in 2021 demonstrated the power of daily stitching, writing about the sewing machine as agency for women who designed and made outfits for the women of the dance hall in Jamaica in Akeem Smith No Gal Contest, or exploring pattern as practice and the day-to-day repetition of practices and patterns that enable individuals to bear the complexities of living in my essay contribution, Epiphanies of Dress, to the Labaina Hamid Tate exhibition catalogue 2021, through which I first came across what the essay, What is Pattern? By Soetso Yanagi, published in 1932. So armed with all this and more, I invited Amy to co-develop the project. We decided to go back to basics, to consider some of the elements associated with stitching through conversations. So a MAI-DAY Textile Elements, a series of conversations, is a space where practitioners can collectively explore connections and disconnections that in turn could inform new thinking through making directions. The Textile Elements conversation series brings together pairs of practitioners from different aspects of stitch making and related craft art practice to share thoughts about 3 fundamental aspects of stitch practice, but abstract terms: plain sewing, which was last week, piecing today, and pattern. These are all familiar aspects of stitch practice, but what do they mean for practitioners who explore them from different perspectives? And Amy and I would like to thank Polly Leonard and Selvage Maxine for joining us as a partner. Over to you, Amy.
Okay, so as we developed our plans for these conversations, with all of the stuff that Carol brought with her, we thought it would be useful to have some shared reference points that we could discuss. So what we got to was, for each theme, we've selected a number of very short text extracts from a few different sources, which our speakers might make reference to as their conversation unfolds, completely up to them. So you can find those on a Padlet, which I think Elise will put into the chat for us now. Thanks, Elise. So in a moment, I'll introduce our 2 speakers and pose a first question to get things going. But first, just want to explain a little about the format of the session. So we're going to let the conversation run, mainly between Matthew and Linda, but perhaps with a question or 2 from Carol and I for an hour or so. And then for the last half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour, we'd like to open up the conversation to questions from you all. So at that point, we'll ask you to post your questions in the chat and we'll ask them on your behalf. Okay, so finally, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. So first, Linda Brothwell, who's a British visual artist. Multidisciplinary practice casts her as a maker of objects, tools, and publicly cited interventions. She considers what it means to make something by hand that takes care as its core, to not only make the thing, but to make the tools to make the thing, and to spend months or years immersed in the techniques, the materials, and the stories of a place. Linda is a graduate of the Royal College of Art, where she's now a lecturer, and Sheffield Hallam University. And our other speaker is Matthew Harris, who makes work in both paper and cloth that employs painting, cutting and hand stitching. Working primarily from things seen, the imagery is pieced, patched, assembled and reassembled using improvisatory processes designed to facilitate the interpretation and exploration of imagery around a given theme. Matthew has exhibited widely throughout the UK, Europe, the US and Japan, and has work in the Crafts Council collection, the Whitworth Museum and Art Gallery, and the International Quilt Museum in Nebraska, USA, and numerous private collections. In 2010, he was shortlisted for the first Arts Foundation Award for Textile Art. And hot off the press, Matthew's work is in an exhibition called Seven, which opens tomorrow at Alice Black Gallery in London and is on until the middle of May. Okay, so welcome Linda and Matthew. We're so pleased to have you here. And no pressure, but we had a really great conversation last week. So we're really looking forward to seeing where this one goes. So we'll start with the same question that we posed last week, really. So when we initially invited you to take part in this, can you recall what your first thought was about the theme of piecing? How do you interpret the term? And how does your work relate to the theme? So maybe Matthew, if you want to go first.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for inviting me to take part in the conversation. Well, the theme of piecing, I mean, it's interesting just kind of hearing you speak my biography, which I kind of, you know, and I find it quite hard reflecting on the processes that I use, but the bits of writing that you sent were really interesting, and for me in particular, the piece about building and architecture was really exciting, because I think the idea of piecing for me is really about kind of construction and a very sort of physical engagement with the material as a way of, I suppose, developing my thinking and developing imagery. So it's really about a kind of handling and a moving about of information, and that's what excites me about piecing. And I'm also I'm really interested in elements of chance and indeterminacy again, and that the impact of that on imagery. And so I suppose this idea of moving information around, which is what happens with piecing, that really excites me, and the effect that piecing has in terms of presenting you with something to kind of respond to. I think it was really exciting to see Linda's work, who doesn't work within textiles as yet. But you know, it's very in a sense, you know, it's very easy to have a conversation with someone who works in textiles because you kind of share a language, and I can see that Linda and I share a language, but there are also differences in terms of the materials that she's using, and I find that particularly exciting because I'm curious as to how she makes decisions about materials, where things sit, how she's actually piecing and constructing. So I hope that you know that will be an interesting, because I think, as I said, it's about this kind of physical engagement, and kind of, for me, it's very much kind of moving things around, keeping things kind of in motion and fluid. You know, with my work, I'm turning things backwards and forwards and moving information from the back to the front, cutting through layers, reallocating things. I'm interested in how Linda kind of joins and sits things in, because it's there's a really nice piece in that I'm just looking for it now, the piece on architecture, just about settling things in, I think. And also in kind of thinking about this conversation, I went to the list that I have on the studio wall of Richard Serra's list of activities, which I always find really inspiring. And I just wrote a few down that I kind of thought might apply to both mine and Linda's process. So if you're not familiar, I mean, lots of people are very familiar with them, but I only came across them fairly recently. But just this wonderful list of activities, in a way, to apply to materials as a way of kind of moving ideas on and just thinking about materials. So I wrote down to roll, to crease, to crumple, to inlay, to impress, to rotate, to disarrange, that's a nice one, to tear, to cover, and to dig, and to distill. And I just think those kind of, for me, encompass a lot of the elements that begin to happen when you start to piece and move information around. So,
lovely.
Yeah, that's my intro.
Over to you, Linda.
Yeah, so I guess, well, first, thanks for having me, and hello. And apologies for my cat. My cat was trying to find out where Matthew was coming from, so it might happen again. So, yeah, I guess it's interesting for me because I don't come from a textiles background and I don't work in textiles at all. It's one of the very few materials that I don't work with. Because I'm rubbish at it, by the way, it's not for any other reason. And I was saying to Carol and Amy that I'm saving it for my my hobby years later. So the idea of piecing as a textile practice is quite far removed from the way I think, but the idea of, I was really interested actually the way Matthew was talking about it, about piecing information. So for me, when I'm embarking on a new piece of work, the ideas, the materials, the skills, the place, all play kind of equal roles. They are all physical in a way, even though ideas, they are physical for me, that I have to kind of grapple with them and hold them and maneuver them, whether that's text that I've read, quotes that I've read, areas of research that I've been kind of looking at. They're all elements that I have to play with, and I have to try to work out what takes center stage, what goes to the back, what kind of plays a supporting role, what floats in the same universe but doesn't maintain a kind of core part of the new work, but maybe it'll come into question later on, or maybe I'll pull it in later on. So that idea of piecing as a kind of creative process in the studio as a practitioner, whether that is a physical piecing things together, or whether that is kind of grappling with your ideas, your dreams, your hopes for a material, the kind of technical stuff that you're doing as well, how those things can layer and how kind of the difficulties of them can suddenly become the interesting bit or the kind of sparky bit that you want to dive into. And that allowing yourself to sit with that, allowing yourself to be okay with the fact that it doesn't piece together. It will always be a series of layerings and kind of bringing things forward and putting things backwards. So that action, which I speak in kind of these active words because for me it is. So these ideas that I'm kind of trying to make work about, or the questions that I have that I'm looking at for a particular project, they are physical things to me. I'm pulling them out of myself. And so sitting with that is a part of piecing things together a little bit, how Carol was talking earlier about pattern cutting, putting things together and laying them and seeing how it can work, for me is a really important early stage of any kind of project. It doesn't always stay like that, but the first part is always kind of a landscape. I'm trying to create a landscape and understand where is interesting to me. So yeah, piecing, I do now know what it means in textiles, but I didn't. But for me, it is this planning, planning, mapping.
Mm.
The planning in, because I'm interested in the kind of improvisatory nature of it, the kind of, I think I said earlier, the sort of fluidity of that. And it's interesting you talk about ideas as well as physical objects. It is that thing of, I mean, really interested in this idea of keeping things in motion, and at what point you allow them to kind of settle. But also for me, I think in a lot of the work I do with paper that's bound with thread, and I suppose with the stitched pieces, I want there to be a sense that it always has the potential to be something else, that perhaps those the configuration that's come about could be temporary and potentially could have been any other type of configuration. So, I mean, I have a number of kind of procedures really built into my work in order to bypass or to interrupt too much kind of conscious placing of things. You know, I'm interested in how so with those pieces of wood with the inlays that we were talking about before everyone joined us, how do you you know, I'm really interested in the process by which you make a decision about where those shapes sit.
Yeah, so it's, for me, it's two sides, two things that shouldn't make sense together. Everything stays in flux in my mind, but I work in incredibly solid materials that need precision and a huge amount of time and care. So I like things to stay moving and I like things to stay true in many different ways. But at some point, I need to have solidity because I can spend 40 hours doing one inlay. So there has to be an agreement with myself that this is true now.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean there isn't a future work. So the way I kind of make it make sense to myself is that I work in rolling projects. So I have a project called Acts of Care, which there's many iterations of, and the inlay pieces that you're talking about, they're part of an act of care, and it's a rolling project that I will do forever. So whatever's true now isn't going on my headstone. It's the correct and the honest response and answer to the questions I'm asking with who I am stood there at that moment. But in a year's time, my questions will be different because I will be a different human and the world will be different. So everything is true as it stands, but I'm okay with the fact that it will be a different, but still true later on. Yeah. So it can't, the flux has to mean for me that it has to have truth. It has to have, you know, coming off points where you say, well, this is true now.
Yeah.
And life changes and it will change. The iteration in 3 years' time will be different. Yes. But it was still true at the time. So it's a weird, I'm really happy in the uncomfortable places. And I have to be because of how I work. Because everything I do takes so long. I mean, you know, it's just that inlay piece is, so just as a quick housekeeping on it, it's a thing called Bench Repair Project, which started in 2000 and I'm going to say 9, but I might be wrong on that. It might be 2010. So it is, I did a piece of work where I was repairing public benches in Lisbon for Experimenta Biennial. And I replaced and repaired the slats all around the city with incredibly decorative Donna Maria inlay design. So I went to Portugal, learned how to do wood inlay, and then went around replacing the damaged slats in the city's benches with these kind of traditional Portuguese designs. And part of the idea for that was about repair and about care, but also about allowing the kind of decorative elements that were traditionally only now in museums or very, very kind of rich houses to be just the city's benches. And then 2 years ago, for We Are Commoners, the thing that Amy and I are kind of been working on together, this idea, I did an iteration in the UK. So the design is completely different. So the design that the image on the kind of thing for today are these patches and stitches and holes and things like that. So that's looking at the language of repair. So it's a completely different visual identity of the project, but it's true now for the place that it is. And I still believe the other one to be true for then. So it's a weird, I don't know, I have to kind of be okay with everything all being there at the same time. How do you kind of deal with it? But
in a sense, I think that's perhaps what, I mean, that's what I kind of want from the work all the time, a certain kind of dissonance. And so I want that feeling of not knowing whether it's quite right. And that's why, in a sense, I build these kind of procedures in whereby I have to leave something. I can't do anything more to it. You know, I've been through the process. It's thrown up that thing, and you know, that hole appears there, and I have to fill it. And I don't have any choice about what I fill it with, or I'm trying to make a line move across the surface of fabric. I'm looking for the pieces that are buried within the layers of cloth. And if they're not there, I can't use them. I have to either use something else, or I have to rethink. So I think this idea of repair and piecing is really interesting, and how what you choose to sort of sit in that space, whether it's something that feels integrated and blends, or whether it's something that is as I said, has a real visual dissonance and is kind of unsettling. And so I find that process really interesting. And for me, the pieces that are always the most exciting are the ones that I kind of keep having to look at, and sort of they feel slightly uncomfortable, and I'm not sure whether they're right or wrong, but actually essentially I know that that's the kind of feeling I want them to have, so therefore they're okay. And like you say, that it's that thing of it being right at that moment, and that you know, so I'm also interested in this idea of when does one stop working on something, because of this whole thing of moving that comes about through piecing. In a sense, one can move things around forever and ever and ever and ever, and not know when to stop.
How do you know when to stop in your work?
Well, I have this kind of I just have these steps, really, and I've tried a number of things over the years, because I identified that the things that really excited me visually were, in a sense, that things that had come about by accident. This is in other things that excited me, and how could I was finding that I was trying to work with that, but then I just kept, with a drawing, for example, kept kind of fiddling and going and moving things around, and then suddenly I thought, well, actually I need to impose a time restriction on myself, so that, and I work from left to right, and so that when that time's finished, the work is finished. And at the moment, I suppose I have a number of processes whereby I'm just kind of, I go through these procedures, and in a way they make decisions for me, they make choices for me. You know, I don't have to kind of make decisions about the color of the thread, or do you know what I mean? And I mean that I am making choices all the time, and I find the tension between how much one makes choices and how much one allows things to happen. I find that really exciting and interesting.
Mm.
But I try to allow the process to lead me to a kind of end point, and then I try not to interfere any more. I kind of think once I've pinned everything, I put it on the wall, and sometimes I'm very tempted to go in and start to shuffle things around, but then I stop myself from doing that. But then it's probably much easier for me to do that than it would be for you. You can't really re-inlay something, so you're having to make that decision before you actually start work, so to speak, on the physical thing.
Yeah, so for me, the fluid part is in the imagining, and then as soon as the chips have fallen where they are or whatever, then I make. So I can't, as soon as I'm not into 3D, because I kind of plan in 3D, but as soon as I'm literally inlaying, then that's it. But but especially with that bench piece, what does then happen is I can lay over the top. So a lot of one of the inlays went wrong because inlaying is really hard. One of them went really wrong and it looked really rubbish in like the top right hand corner. So I just got another piece and popped it over the top, so it was like this. And I was like, cool. Yeah. And I don't even remember which piece it is now. It's like it didn't, it's not tortured me or anything. But I quite like that process where you can just keep working over and over and over on the top of things. But that was very much the language of that project. Yeah. Whereas if I'm working in metal, it is what it is, and it has to be. You have to stop when it's done. In a way, metal is. I don't know. Metal is more alive. It sounds odd, but for me, metal is more alive than wood. I know that doesn't necessarily make sense to a lot of people, but for me, I can make metal live a lot easier than I can make wood live. So I can kind of maneuver metal a bit more, which I know doesn't make logical sense to anyone who doesn't work in metal, but it's true. But have you, when you've kind of created this scaffolding for working, and you've gone through your system, and then you put it up and it's pinned, and do you not ever just go, no, I'll just
No, I don't actually. I don't.
You're not?
No. No. I used to, but now I feel really content to just kind of accept it for how it is. I want to be presented with something that surprises me, and I want to try as much as I can to accept it for what it is, without feeling I need to keep refining it. And that's a kind of never-ending scenario, really. That's why I'm just sort of interested in that process where something makes one sort of stop this kind of moving, this kind of energy, and just allow things to sort of settle and sit, and then just kind of be held in place. But the thing that you talked about something going wrong, and then I find that sort of fascinating, because I for a long time sort of recognized that the things that, as I said, the things that I found really exciting were, in a sense, the things that had gone wrong, and the things that I make work in response to, and the things that I think that are out there in the world that we all look at. We don't generally look at them and think, oh, well, that would be so much better if it was like slightly bluer, if that blue was slightly bluer, or that piece just sat slightly to the left. That we kind of, in the visual world, kind of accept things for what they are in nature, or those surfaces that most of us find very exciting, and then if one is involved in the process of, in a sense, repairing and patching, that it's to allow yourself to think, well, it's okay if it's gone wrong. I just put another patch in. It's fine. If you were to come across that bench you know, somewhere else that, and it hadn't been made by you, do you know what I mean? Is that, am I making sense with that?
So the idea of that kind of noticing that something's gone wrong, and kind of just that ease within which you can just kind of work over the top of it. Yeah.
Yes.
That's unusual for me though, to be honest. It's very much part of that work that you can kind of lay over the top of each other. I think it's hard to describe. I don't mind. I know how a final piece of work should feel.
Yes.
And that's what I'm trying to achieve. So visually, I can move myself with what it can change what it's going to be visually. I don't really mind that. You know, if I really want this particular color patina and I can't achieve it, I can make it feel the same way a different way. But it's the feeling of wholeness that I'm looking for. And that's what I need to get, and then it's finished. It can't be finished until I have that feeling that it's whole, it's resolved. But that can come about in 1,000,001 different ways. So if one of the ways doesn't work, I'll just move to a different way, or a different size, or a different feeling, or a different texture. But I have to be able to get to that end.
Yeah. So you talk very much about this idea of piecing as a way of making something whole again, that was damaged before. Yeah. Yes. But do you always work with, if you're piecing, is the stuff always damaged? So the interventions that you're making are always in damaged areas?
Sometimes. So for acts of care, I work in what I call dead space. So for me, dead space is breakage, damage, missing, unloved, but that's a bit of a trickier one. But there's particular energy to the spaces that I'll work in. So that's like public benches, or missing letters on public signs, which is a project called the Lost Letters of Liverpool. So I was replacing letters, or spaces in gaps in a building where stainless steel was invented. That was the Sheffield edition of the Acts of Care. So these dead spaces are what I work in for Acts of Care. But then sometimes I do completely different projects where I make work completely afresh. So I make, obviously I make tools, but I made vessels to kind of try to give a feeling of the area around Stonehenge. So it changes, but for me, it's always to try to make something right, or it's try to make something whole.
Yeah. That lovely expression that Rauschenberg has, that is it the search for rightness? It's just, again, I think it is this movement, keeping things moving until they kind of settle and almost lock together, really, and become whole.
Yeah. It's that expression of care. That's what I'm interested in. Yeah. And it's putting that forward as a way of being. And so the different spaces or different areas to work in, it's trying to find that. I find that is the kind of the line of truth within the practice. But yeah, so, it's interesting.
Yeah. So in a way, you're sort of talking about a kind of healing element in many respects. Do you mean in a social context, but also just taking that idea of pulling something together and making it integrated and kind of whole?
It's a radical proposition for how we should go about being in the world, and how we should look at community, and how we should look at public space. So it's caring in a very kind of outward way on publicly shared or publicly cited objects, to show that I want to care for them. And I think that that gives you a lot back, that responsibility. But also it's about talking about tools, talking about caring for things, talking about taking ownership of things as a way of proposing why are we not doing that, or why, you know, what can that give you? So it's funny because when I say it's about care, it makes it sound quite soft, and for me it's quite,
yes,
I feel quite active about it. But I was interested, what drew you to, because we both enjoy architecture, and we both enjoyed the kind of the third quote, didn't we? How come that kind of spoke to you? What was it about that
well, for me, I think it was just I think of what I do as a very spatial, three-dimensional thing, even though I'm dealing with a sort of two-dimensional surface. I mean, if anyone's kind of seen my pieces, they're like almost 5 millimeters thick by the time with the layering of the cloth. And as I said it's kind of moving things around and moving backwards and forth. So yes, so the architecture thing was just in my visual imagination. I began to think of piecing as a three-dimensional kind of activity, which for me it is. And I very much, right at the beginning when I started making cloth pieces, I felt it was really important that the layers of cloth were integrated in and structured in a very quite rigorous way. I didn't want to just lay one piece down on top of another. That would have felt a sort of two-dimensional activity. I wanted there to be a kind of robustness to the process, and also I like the words around building. I tend to use those words. I use the idea of construction and assembly, yes, all those kind of things, as a way of reinforcing the idea of this physical kind of process. And the stitch that I make is utilitarian, and it's purely functional. It just is to hold the image in place. It's to go along the edges. And none of the stitch is hidden. I work from the back and from the front. So with buildings, I like the idea of internal structure and then outer things, and then what that piece of writing just, as I said, ignited in my imagination was the idea of a kind of rows of buildings and then suddenly interventions, where other buildings have gone and new buildings are put in, and I just like the kind of quality of it, I think.
It's interesting hearing you talk about making your work, because although you refer to your work saying it's kind of two-dimensional, like it's 5 mil thick, actually when you talk about making it, it's such a kind of really hands three-dimensional kind of grappling process of working from the front, working from the back, and it feels like the language you use, and like you're not kind of as demonstrative as me with your hands, but the language that you use makes me feel like you are. It's like, you're really talking about stitching and cutting and trying to find, and it feels really three-dimensional, the kind of thoughts and the process around your making, and then the result, as you say, is a two-dimensional.
I'm going to
sorry, Carol, what?
I was just going to chip in because I'm just thinking that we have that piece of film of yours, Matthew, which is
oh yeah, you could play that.
Sums up everything you've both been talking about.
Yeah.
So I don't know when you would like to show that now, and you can
show it now, and then I'll just talk through again.
So Elise,
archaeology is also something that I find interesting, and the piecing that happens in archaeology. I think
a small piece of cloth.
Could you turn the sound off, Elise?
Working on that's been
that's better. Yes, so the cloth is built in sort of 4 layers, all of which have exactly the same image painted onto them, and then it's laminated, and then it's pleated, and then it's cut, so that I have kind of buried within the layers of cloth 4 versions of the same image. And then once the whole cloth is pleated together, I then also kind of cut across it so that it becomes a very kind of fluid, it becomes almost like a pelt, and I can lift it and drop it onto the table and overlap areas, and I kind of get a rough sense of what a composition might be. And then I sort of pick the sort of sections apart and piece it together. But it's so that I have access to the layers of cloth on the back and on the front, and then I literally start kind of digging through with a pair of scissors, like you're seeing here, but kind of feeling my way through it as well. And it's on the wall, so I'm moving back and moving forward and sort of peeling layers apart and sort of trying to get a sense of what a new image might look like. So I'm sort of presenting myself with information here that's buried in front of me, and it's because of the way I've kind of restructured it. And you can see in the middle of this here, there's a little sort of inserted section, and that's where the kind of folding process has led to there being a gap that needs to be filled. So that, and then the edge here, the left-hand edge, at some point I'll have to resolve that, and normally that's where I kind of block in with just a sort of, so that this process allows for these holes that I just then fill. So I spend a lot of time just kind of going through the layers and thinking until eventually I then will kind of make a cut and then start to move that information around to make an image whole. And then I'm also very, because of all these layers of cloth, wherever I've taken something away, I have to put something back in order that the layers are consistent through the body of the cloth. So invariably I'm just taking something from one side and moving it back, or sometimes I have to flip the whole thing over to take other pieces of information. They're like skin grafts sometimes, you know, and sort of bedding it in much the same way. You know, that was something I was going to ask you about edges and how one sits one lot of information inside another, and you know, whether you make that very smooth. I mean, in your kind of woodwork, that's something that you have to do in a way, isn't it? You have to kind of, you know, where these things sit next to one another. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think for me, those edges, you've got always edges are an opportunity, right? So you have, nothing is neutral, no, in your case, no kind of image or even the choice of textiles is neutral. And similarly with wood or with metal, everything kind of comes with different references. And so when two things meet, for me at least, that's an opportunity to, okay, am I going to make it really, really smooth and really, really perfect? And then I'm kind of taking away some of that difference and creating something of an elegance. But perhaps that's because the kind of subject matter is quite sharp. And so I want that elegance. I want that kind of softness, or that almost hard to visualize, kind of hard to see kind of idea. Or are you going to say, okay, actually the quality of these two materials, because it's place specific, I'm really excited by the difference of these two materials. And so I want the edges, I want it to jut up against each other, and I want to kind of highlight that difference. And so there is an opportunity there to show old and new, or repaired, or, you know, kind of not cared for. So there is always a choice with anything. I think I'm working a lot at the moment with metal patinas. So I was in Japan as a Churchill Fellow in 2019, looking at different tools and metals and metal colouring techniques there. And I'm doing quite a lot of it at the moment in my studio. And it's wonderful because when you're working with different alloys of metal, and then the chemicals go over the top, and in some ways they can kind of blanket colour everything. But then you put another chemical on the top and they pull out certain parts of the silver or certain parts of the brass that's different to the copper. So it's this constant revealing, and you're almost the conductor of it. And it's a really interesting and really kind of exciting, again, three-dimensional process, because you're knocking things back. When I was watching your video, it was making me think of it, because you're pushing things back, you're pulling things forward, you're twisting things, you're kind of choosing to highlight things. And again, you talked about the wholeness of it as well, of trying to kind of create this image. So there seems to be quite a lot of similarity of working with these materials, even though you would think metal or wood and textiles are really different. Actually, the human trying to find that kind of thread and that kind of voice, it has a lot of similarity, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's that creative process of sort of immersing yourself in something and looking for something and allowing a material to start to speak to you, and then how much you control that to make it do what you want to do, but at the same time allow it such that it presents you with unexpected things, and then takes you off in a different direction, really. Whether that's in how you work with the material or the sort of image that one's making at the end. I mean, that I know that's why I use the processes that I do, this kind of piecing together, because I want all the time, you know, I recognize, it took me a while to recognize that actually this is something that I have always done with anything, drawing, whatever material that I've used in the past. I try to do something to disrupt the thing that I've initially made. I have to do something in order to for it to change in some way that's sort of beyond my, not completely beyond my control, but so that it presents itself to me in a different way, and then I respond to that.
There's quite a lot of trust in that, isn't there? There's quite a lot of trust in your own hands and your own way of being able to kind of adapt to the situation, that, you know, whatever it presents you with, you know, you have to trust your ability to pull out what you want to pull out.
Yes, and it can be a scary process, can't it? I mean, you can often find you're working with something thinking, come on, there's nothing there yet. I mean, often when I put these pieces on the wall that I've painted all these layers of cloth with an image, and then I've pleated it, and then I've cut into it, and I've kind of played around with it on the table, and I put it on the wall, and I kind of just think, oh, how on earth am I gonna, I can't see anything. I can't see where it's going to go as a thing, and that is kind of very scary, but also really exciting as a process, because I just think, I have to really work. I have to really work to kind of, and I have to be really open to that material or that image, and I did this project with Howard Skempton, the composer, and he just used to talk about being awake to the material. He was talking about musical notes, but I've used that so much in that thinking all the time, just looking to see what's there, and just in a sense waiting and engaging with it, and really sort of seeing and trusting that actually, because I think through this idea of piecing and moving material, and actually things come about through moving and a kind of physical interaction with that material, as opposed to a sort of distant, just observing. I mean, I feel like that for me, that my hands are telling, I mean, I think, you know, that's what craftspeople, you know, it's your hands are telling you as much as your eyes. It's the visceral sensation of interacting with this material that
I think that shift for me, sort of as you get older, I mean, your eyesight isn't as good, which is a downside in our line of work, but you know, but on the positive side, that for me at least, that really soft change into completely trusting my hands.
Yeah,
I can stay with an uncomfortable unknowing for a lot longer than anyone else thinks is at all okay, including curators. And I know I trust it, and I know it works out. And that is a lovely, when you're kind of working with students, I kind of notice it more, that it's such a privilege to know that you can trust in your own hands.
Yeah, yes.
Can't see, but
blurry things can be fantastic.
And
always telling students to squint at something.
And I know we're coming up to 4, but there was something in the conversation that you both had, our initial conversation, just getting to know each other, and I can't remember who said it, but
was this about me saying about what
the dance of the hands. Was it you, Linda? Which I thought was one of the last things I wrote, which I thought was beautiful.
I think as a tool maker, you become obsessed with, well, everything is, the body has to work completely in sync with the tools, right? So for me, I'm very interested in mapping what hands are doing, because even just on a functional level, your hands and the where you're sat, how you're sat, all of the things around you, the journey from one place to the next place is really important in tool making. And so that action of your hands is really important. But I think I was mentioning it because when we spoke originally, and Matthew was talking about his work, and again, it was very much in that 3-dimensional thing, and this sort of almost, it's like a beautiful dance between, or it seemed to be a beautiful dance between him and his work, and kind of the pleats and opening and exposing and shifting and moving. And it just felt like, I want to see what your hands are doing. Like, I want to watch from the start of the work to the end of the work. I want to see like what tools you're using, but also just what your hands are doing, because it feels very 3-dimensional. How does it feel for you, Matthew? Do you share video of your work? I know you showed us the one earlier, but like in exhibition context, do you show video?
No, there was something online when I did the Field Notes project with Craftspace and Howard Skempton, where I recorded the process. I recorded making work from above, but actually I've sort at that stage, I think, and I was making work. I think I was making work on the flat much more. That was about 10 years ago. You know, now I make work kind of, it's on the wall and I'm moving close and far away. But no, I haven't really done that, because also then, you know, as people who stitch, and if you know, with me it's can't goes from up there to then suddenly this, and you know, they're not easy things to kind of move around because they're quite thick, and then they're all pinned, and so I am sort of, often I have, and when I put at the first stage of pleating, I'm putting them through the machine, and so the cloth is really long, so I have to stand up. I pull the foot pedal of the sewing machine right out, so I have to stand up and kind of feed this kind of beast through the machine. And then I'm kind of cutting down through all those layers, and then, as I said, and then it becomes fluid, and I'm sort of dumping it on the table and moving it around, and then cutting away from underneath so that things drop in to place. So yes, a time lapse would be quite interesting from start to finish.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's like the work, it's, as craftspeople, I think it's easy to think that the most interesting or the most important thing is the work. And of course, in some ways it is, but actually another part of it is your body. And that's fascinating.
Absolutely.
As well. Like that, you know, you're saying you're dumping it on the table and you're like pulling the foot pedal out and you're feeling it through, like that. It's not even about the up close, just that dance in your space. Amazing.
No, I think dance is a really good word for it. And in a sense, you know, as makers, we kind of develop this language over time and take it for granted, really, and don't you know, we're aware of it, but you know, it's not something I spend, other than in circumstances like this. You know, it's only when people sort of start to ask how it's made, and you're forced to sort of reflect on, you know, oh God, you know, it's quite laborious. You know, these kind of endless things you go through, which over the years, you know, one has sort of developed in order to make the work do things you need it or want it to do. Yeah.
And I'm going to say one more thing, and it's back to you, Linda, is that you said, again in our conversation, you talked about your work being about an alphabet of repair, which I thought was beautiful in terms of all the different things that, and kind of creating your own alphabet of repair. And then I made reference to the graphic design work, or kind of graphic design work, of Paul Ellerman and him finding alphabets in found objects. So again, I just thought I'd throw that one in before we go to questions.
Yeah, I guess so. That bench repair project, as it shifted from Lisbon to the UK, obviously I needed to change the language of the project, because everything I make is place specific, and so the Lisbon project had its own thing, and I wanted to make a new iteration that was specific to the UK. And I kind of, because I've worked in and around repair and tool making for sort of 15 years, I wanted to try to look at this language of repair, and I have huge kind of backlog of photographs of different repairs and different kind of things that I see out and about, and I wanted to try to look at these patches and stitches and all of this other kind of language, kind of going into textile or road repair or car, you know, duct tape on cars, all of that sort of stuff, and to bring it in together to create this almost alphabet or kind of language, or this kind of alphabet of repair, to be able to use these as the kind of palette for that project. It's an interesting one because I'm using a palette of repair, but the stitches aren't honest in a way, because I'm using it as decorative. So there is a difficulty there. And the reason I made that decision was because I had to start to think about what I wanted people to feel about the work. So because these they're artworks, but they're in public space, and I wanted to raise questions and invite people to think of repair as beautiful, and to see repair as beautiful, and also to question why on earth there's this funny patch and a stitch on a bench in wood. What's that about, and why is it inlaid? And you know, kind of what do we assume public space is for when there's something that's kind of so painstakingly done? So it was an interesting battle I had with myself, because, as I say, I'm not patching genuinely, I'm using it as decoration, but I decided to do that because I think the end result of it does fulfill what I want. But it is it's like, I guess in the textile thing, like, you know, this like borrow and sashiko and, you know, kind of putting over the top of stuff as a decorative element, there is this losing, diluting kind of context, and that can become tricky.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was I grappled with it, and I made a decision to do it as a piece. But yeah, I'm not unaware of, it's something I still kind of argue with myself about.
Interesting tensions. In my stuff, I mend things that don't need mending, but for particular reasons. But anyway, so thank you so much to both of you. It's been fascinating. We've got a bit of time left, and we'd like to open up the conversation to questions from people who are here. So everybody else, if you feel comfortable, bearing in mind that we are recording, please feel free to turn your camera on at this point, so it feels a bit more like we're sitting in a room together a bit. So yeah, feel free to turn your cameras on if you like. And if you have a question, please post it in the chat, and Carol will ask them on your behalf. And we've got a couple already, so I'll hand over to Carol.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and Matthew and Linda, thank you. That was incredible. So the first question is from Pam. I've often wondered if Matthew's finished works have some heft to them, similar to a weighted blanket. Does the tactile feeling of the pieces matter as well as the visual texture while you're working on a piece, Matthew?
Yes, and they do have weight. Yes, as I said, they are quite thick and they're quite stiff, and I kind of press them so that, and obviously the stitching goes right through all the layers, so they're very held together, and and the feeling of the sensation that I get from making them is very important. The surface of the fabric. I use a very kind of cheap cotton twill, so they're not kind of fancy, and they've been painted with layers of acrylic paint. So, you know, they're quite rough to handle. They're not, but that's the kind of quality I want in them, really. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is from Shirley. I think this is aimed at Linda. Shirley asks, I enjoyed the conversation when you talked about expressions of care, and I connected it to the repair of clothing and wondered what you think of this in relation to caring for society and the planet.
It's an interesting one. I think in terms of acts of care, I think it is about putting forward a potential and putting forward a way of being. I should say as well, acts of care always has a full set of handmade tools for it. So a lot of it is about that kind of activation and feeling like you have control and you know how to use your hands and kind of how to different ways of going around in the world. I work a lot in public space. I work a lot on publicly sited objects. And for me, that's how I interact with the idea of society and community, is I will look at objects as opposed to people. I do that intentionally because I think that's how I can connect. I'm a materials specialist. I work with my hands. I think in objects. And so for me, I focus on public objects, especially the thing with the bench repair project, looking at that. The UK version is in a park, and I spent a lot of time looking at parks, and looking at the one near me is a Victorian park, and looking at the objects that used to be there, looking at how when you have a park that has these material examples of craftsmanship, this materials examples of feeling held by society, by having things of beauty, by having extra ornament, by you feel cared for, by having the benches that curl around the top and then they go and then they dip up. So you're your bum is held, you know, you can stand on the back of it and lean against it because it rolls around the top. You have the things for your arms with, you know, a lion's head or whatever. So materially, these kind of spaces make you feel different. And that's what I'm interested in. That's how I'm interested in caring for society, because I think that the objects that we surround ourselves with and the objects that our councils and our government allow us to be surrounded with affect how you go about your day.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Thank you, Linda. Next question is from Fee for Linda. Linda, when you pick a piece of wood or metal and it does not feel right, do you still work with the piece and work through the block, or would you choose another piece that brings out an emotional connection?
It's an interesting one. So if the piece is pre-existing, so with wood, the inlay I make from broken furniture because I don't want to have trees cut down for my work, basically. So I use little bits of old junk. Sorry, I was going to swear. And I make the inlay out of that. That is alive in my mind. Objects are either alive or they're dead. For me, that's alive. So I have a feeling towards that, whether I want to work with it or not. Generally speaking, I find beauty in most things. So I generally work with it. When it comes to metal, I work with raw materials. So it doesn't have that same feeling to it. So for me, it's about, I put the feeling into it. This all can sound a bit, I realize I sound a little bit crazy, but anyway, this is true. It is what it is. What can you do? But yeah, so the metal, the raw material, if I buy bar or I buy sheet or I buy grain and I alloy something, for me, that doesn't have a content at all. And I put the content into it. So I would never make a decision to use it or not use it because it's kind of neutral in a way. Whereas the existing objects have much more content around them. So that has a bit more of a decision. I realize this isn't a very clean answer, sorry, but it's, yeah. Sorry, Fee.
Thank you. Next question, and we think it's from E. Osborne. It's a question for Matthew. On Matthew's pleated work, what fabric and paint did you use, or do you use?
I use builder's dust sheet. Cheap and cheerful builder's dust sheet from the Builders Merchants, another link with architecture. And I use very thin acrylic paint, sort of, I would say, dye consistency acrylic paint that's painted in layers, built up layers of a very thin paint. That's it.
Right, we have no more questions at the moment. I'm just trying to think now, got to think on my feet. I'm not...
I've got one, Carol.
Oh, thank you, Amy.
I'm referring back to my notes. So in our pre-conversation, there was a really good bit of conversation about Sister Carita Kent and John Cage. Can you read that bit? That was a really good bit to share.
Yes.
Linda burst my cage adoration bubble. toppled my God. But yeah, they were really interesting, those things that you sent through. I can't remember them all now, but yeah, so just to put people, we were talking about a quote from which I thought was from Cage, but Linda said was from Sister, what's her name? Sister?
Yeah, Carita Kent.
Yes, and it's about, the quote is, there is no win nor fail, there is only make, because that's the word.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's from the Immaculate Heart College, and it's, I think it's 10 steps.
Yeah.
Kind of learning, or 10 steps to being in art college. But yeah, it was one of them. Sorry, it wasn't Cage. I kind of feel as well, you know.
That's fine.
If it's a woman, I'm like, no, come on, let's get it.
I appreciate that completely, completely. You know, Yeah, I mean, it is a wonderful, I use it at the top of a lot of projects with, because it's such a fantastic thing about, isn't it, to just sort of, you just got to try stuff and, you know, keep things moving, to go back to the points that we made earlier, and trust. I think trust is a huge thing, that actually you have it within yourself to resolve things and make the work interesting through this engagement with the materials and process. Yeah.
I've just had a thought. A phrase kept coming up, I first heard the phrase from Matthew to me, and when I was doing one of his courses, and I created something, and he said, "Carol, it is what it is. Just let it go. Just leave it." And then Linda, you said that as well today, and then Matthew said it again today. So it's this phrase of "it is what it is," and it just, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it was basically what you're both saying. There's the moment when, Linda, you said, you know, it feels right, and that's when you start. And Matthew, you're letting the fabric speak to you, and the processes and the scaffolding that you'd put together. But yeah, my eyes lit up when Linda used that phrase, and I went, now I know what Matthew meant by "it is what it is."
Well, that phrase, I have to say, I did get that from Cage as well. But it is because he used it in conjunction with, you know, the procedures that he established around, obviously the writing of a lot of his music, but also the visual art that he made. And just, you know, it was that thing of, you're putting these procedures in place to allow something to happen, and you have to allow yourself to observe what's happened as a result of that procedure, and just to accept that that thing is itself. And often I think, well, if that procedure has thrown up something that you don't like, then you just do it again, and you do it again, and actually, and then often, if you, as I said in our discussion, accepting that something just kind of is what it is, and often if you come back to it later on, you kind of look at it and think, well, actually it's quite interesting, you know, aesthetically something in me didn't like that earlier. But if the process that you're going through is about discovery, then you have to allow things to happen that you might be uncomfortable with, or might feel unresolved, or aesthetically a bit challenging. Yes, so that's.
If you're working at your edges, if you're pushing your practice to the very edge of what you know now to try to grow, of course, by working at the edges, there will be success and there will be what seems to be failure. And that's part of expanding what you know to be true. So I think if it fails, of course, we don't know what version of failure we're talking about. But if it does, you know, if it doesn't work how you want it to work, then I'd be really concerned if someone was doing something that worked every time. It kind of, I mean, firstly, how boring is that? But also, you're not pushing your edges.
Mm.
But what is working? You know, what is working? You know, that you bring your preconceptions, all your preconceptions acquired throughout your life, to your visual assessment of something. And actually, we all know that, you know, when that's turned on its head, it can be incredibly exciting when you see something that you kind of think, well, that shouldn't work, but it's fantastic. It's the same in music. You know, it's the same, and you listen to experimental music or jazz, you know, you just think, whoa, what's that? But those are the points that kind of just, you think you're sort of challenged by, about your perceptions of the world and what's in it.
Mm.
So we've got 2 more questions, and these are going to be the last ones. And the first of the last two questions is from Julie. Julie asked, and it's to both of you, please could I ask both artists about piecing? How much does appearance matter? How far is it an aesthetic process, and how far a functional one in terms of how things fit together and how they are joined?
I guess it depends what it is that you're doing. So I think whenever something's coming together, there is an aesthetic opportunity. But of course, if you're setting out a proposition of function, then there is a functional part to it as well. If I'm making a tool, then putting things together has to be correct for the language of the thing that I'm making, and it has to work. we're in the working, not working territory again, but it has to do what I'm intending it to do. But if it's not functional, then I could take that opportunity of something coming together as a potential to lay narrative or to play with material. How about you, Matthew?
Well, for me, I think the excitement comes in the kind of space in between those two things, really. Appearance and process. And, I think I said already, I'm kind of using a process in order to shape an image or change an image. And appearance matters, but how it matters, I'm not sure. Yeah, appearance, of course it matters, but I'm using process to affect appearance, and as I said earlier, to present myself with something. So I think the two are interact with one another in a really interesting way, and it's that sort of space in the middle, which where exciting things happen. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so.
It's complex. And last question from Joni. Questions to both Linda and Matthew. Were you always able to entertain elements of chaos, or was that a process you learned to embrace? Nice.
Matthew.
That's great.
I've always been really, no, I have learned to embrace it. I've always, I've always been really interested in it. But I didn't quite, and I wouldn't, I'm not sure chaos is the right word, actually. I'm really interested in indeterminacy, and as I've already said, the tension between control and lack of control, intent and non-intention, is that the right word? Yes, so the tension between those things, and for me, that's why I put these kind of procedures and systems in place in order to prevent myself from getting kind of bogged down in finessing something too much, or in preempting what I think might happen. So I want that disruption to happen at some point, but it's the tension between things being disrupted or not disrupted. It's that kind of space in between. Again, I know it's a sort of weird phrase, but I think it does describe a sort of an area in which I want to kind of operate, where these different forces are having an impact on what I do.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? For me, it can't be 100% one or the other. The work that I do requires sometimes an absolutely pristine studio, for example, because I can't cross-contaminate materials. And so the idea of chaos, I really enjoy order in making, actually. I really enjoy order, and I'm dyslexic, and I like ordering things. I like compartmentalizing things to create some kind of logical system for myself to exist in the world fluidly and kind of be able to understand things. So I dislike chaos in many respects. But so if you come to my studio, it's super tidy. But on the other hand, I like excitement and movement and unknowing in my work. And I can't have that without incredible precision in everything else. So it's almost like I need an incredibly boring and straightforward and locked down external to allow the vibrancy and the chaos and the questions that come from internal. So I need both.
It's fascinating.
I don't think you get one without the other, really. Yeah, I think as an artist, you need that sort of rigor in a way, and then you find ways in which to disrupt that, or kind of let the light in various ways. But yes, you need both those things.
It's funny though, isn't it? Because when people think about an artist, often, you know, sort of friends from completely different walks of life, they oh, I bet you're late for everything, or oh, I bet. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I have color coded everything. I know exactly, like I have archives, like it's boring as hell.
Yeah.
Because I have to have a system which allows me the energy that I need for the unexpected to exist in my work. But it's funny, like the people from the outside are like, oh, artists, you know, you're chaotic, you're badly organized, you know, you don't know which way's up. It's like, no, we're many things, but you know, that's a kind of, it's a funny viewpoint, I think.
Amazing. Right, I'm going to draw this to a close. A bit like last week, I feel like we could roll on and on and on. Pull in more and more things. So thank you so much, Linda and Matthew. It's been really, really fascinating. I hope it's been a rich conversation for you too. I think there's been so many ideas that people will be taking away. Thank you to everyone for coming. And thank you to Elise, who's been making everything work behind the scenes. So we've got one more of these online conversations next week. Same time next Wednesday, and you're very welcome to join us if you can. You can still book a place. And the next conversation focuses on our third theme of pattern, with speakers Jessica Ogden and Marcia Bennett-Mail. And yes, all of the sessions being recorded and will be made available online in due course. So if you aren't able to attend live next week, so you can follow up later, and you would be able to catch up on the conversation from last week if you weren't there, because that was another great one. So I think that's all. And we can just say thank you again, Linda and Matthew. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah. Thank you, Matthew.
A nice Wednesday afternoon activity. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming.